Can we go now?
Uh, one
It's
second.
streaming. It's streaming live.
Okay. 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 Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for this.
Yours, Tzuchien.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I welcome sort of comments and questions. Just don't, just do it in the chat box. Okay, so this is a work in progress. Actually, this is a paper that I have promised somebody else, and like a very diligent person, I've actually worked on it before the deadline. Because it's not always like that in academia. So one of the rare occasions in my life that I've done that. So it's a work in progress. I know that there are still some logical holes I have to fill, but we can discuss them. I have a general idea about how I want to fill them, but here we go. So the idea is that more Geometrico refers to the sort of Cartesian demonstration via to use the geometrical style, which is what more Geometrico means in Latin, to do philosophy, right? And there's been always kind of this interplay between mathematical demonstration and sort of philosophical reasoning or philosophical demonstration. Sometimes it's held as an ideal. Funnily, in Plato, it's just the initiation into a certain kind of thinking, and that obviously it's a preparation for the dialectic. So it's a kind of how do you say? It's the kindergarten of thought. Right, it's the kindergarten of thought. Anyhow, and then sometime when this method was, or this approach to demonstrate to writing philosophy was popular, it was also emerged a sort of new thinking about the infinite, and these two different things get intertwined in I think very interesting ways that still have repercussions today. So what I'll be presenting today is a kind of history heavy. But it's all in the service of sort of thinking clearly about what has changed historically about the relation between philosophy and mathematics. And what I essentially claim is that we move into a domain where the infinite starts to be dissociated with any particular kind of object, and becomes a generic concept. But I'll get into a bit more of what that involves a bit later. The other thing is that part of the motivation of this paper is there is a recording stopped. Okay, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but there is a not super well-known philosopher in the Anglophone world, but who is extremely important, which is Leon Brunswick. And in his book, Les Étapes de la philosophie mathématique, which is quite influential in the French language, he sort of argues that essentially the reason why Spinoza's project was not able to continue was because he did not have like a proper grasp on the concept of the infinite, and was skeptical of the innovations in mathematics that his contemporaries were making, and in particular that of Leibniz, Leibniz infinitesimal method. And so therefore, it's an interesting way to sort of test out the relationship between this more geometrical style, which is very closely associated with Spinoza. I mean, the Ethics is written, one of the few books that is sort of as pure in its adoption of that way of writing. And then also the sort of one of the important sort of founders of the generic concept of the infinite, which is Leibniz. Okay, we're back recording. So here we go, right? So in order to talk about anything in this field, probably have to begin with Aristotle. Let's see. When I went into, are you seeing my slide control page, or are you seeing the actual slides?
Both.
Both, really?
Well, I mean, I see your slide, yeah.
Okay, you see the slide. Okay.
And then I see the next slide too. So it's, yeah.
Okay, so so in Aristotle, especially in the posterior analytics, Aristotle is keen to kind of defeat the Platonist view on mathematical objects, and so he wants to say that they don't exist independently. So how do you do that, right? So despite arguments about the questions of mathematical ontology, the paradigmatic status of mathematical knowledge stands in for knowledge as such in the posterior analytics, right? So, and so, you know, what is this about? So the main issue here is that in order to deny the Platonists the independent status of mathematical objects, Aristotle argues especially in metaphysics, Mu and Nu, that sort of mathematical objects are abstracted from nature, right? So they can somehow be located in nature, right? But abstracted from it. I'll get to this in a second. And that's on the one hand, right? What kind of metaphysical analysis of mathematical objects are needed. On the other hand, right, you have the modeling of the standard of knowledge on mathematics, especially the geometrical style, especially in the posterior analytics, where the sort of analysis of the roots of the possibility of knowledge is developed in a way that models Euclid's geometry, right? And the prehistory of a geometrical style really dates only to Descartes, who really does it for the first time in the Objection and Replies in the 1640s. But you know, this tradition can really be traced back to the posterior analytics, and so you know, we need to sort of talk about Aristotle, especially in a Macedonian framework, huh? So that's for you. Object and so right. So the link between knowledge and being is fundamental, right? So that's an important feature that Aristotle never gives away, right? Because in order to defeat the Platonists, Aristotle needs to always sort of refer back to the legitimacy of mathematical knowledge by this link between knowledge and being, especially what I'm going to say next, which is that mathematical knowledge is the knowledge of objects abstracted from spatial things. So, for example, the circularity of a gold ring is abstracted from the ring, right? The ring exists, right? The circularity is abstracted from it. Therefore, there's a kind of objective underpinning. We don't have to refer to the forms. And therefore, a subtraction or separation of the circle from the ring away from its other properties, right? Its goldness, for example. Right, so geometrical knowledge is justified through disconnection, through abstraction, or it can also be, aphoresis can also be, you know, interpreted as subtraction or separation. Some years ago, I was fascinated by a kind of debate about the status of this term. It's quite a interest of mine that I haven't been able to get back to until recently. Okay, so in metaphysics, he says, and I won't read the whole quote, but basically, you know, it is true to say without qualification that objects of mathematics exist and with the character ascribed to them by mathematicians. So he's legitimating the mathematical discourse by this process of abstraction. He says, so too is it with geometry. If its objects happen to be sensible, though it does not treat them qua sensible, The mathematical sciences will not, for that reason, be the science of sensibles, nor, on the other hand, of the other things separate from sensibles. Now, this is a kind of a delicate passage, and there's a lot here. But essentially, I want to point out to the fact that the implication here is that what is abstracted from sensible things doesn't have to be there in a apparent way, right? So something can be treated qua, right, is ontologically linked to that object, but it can have a separate conceptual development that is not doesn't have to be tied to it. So mathematical sciences is not the science of the sensibles, even if its objects originate, if you will, from the sensible, separated from the sensible world. And you start to see that there's a kind of process which emerges, which is insofar as objects, sort of the more certain and demonstrative a knowledge is, right? The science will be dealing with more abstracted type of objects, right? So the further the science is away from the thing abstracted, the more certain and the more demonstrable that thing is, right? When it's stuck in the kind of the multiple determinations that an object actually has, like think about the goldness of the ring is irrelevant, right, to the circularity of the geometer, but they're both instantiated in the gold ring. So there seems to be this pattern, right? This pattern of abstraction and purification, right? So scientific objects, right, the better ones are more purified. And so you kind of a spectrum that emerges from this process of abstraction where there's a kind of purification of the object from this original conception of Aristotle's, which was meant to sort of refute the Platonistic approach to mathematical objectivity. So the retroactive attribution of more Geometrico to Aristotle is in fact made with some difficulty, right? It is clear that the posterior analytics holds up the mathematical or geometrical demonstration as a paradigm of clarity. And beyond that, right, this spectrum that I was talking about of more purified scientific objects sort of goes very well along with this point, right? But Aristotle himself doesn't really address this point. He doesn't really say, "Oh, this is how we were self-consciously modeling demonstration after geometry." Right. So the definition, axiom, hypothesis, organization of demonstrative knowledge is indeed an adaptation of Euclidean style geometry. The point is generally accepted, but in fact, there is a wide debate about its significance. Some of the people argue that is more due to the kind of ontological aspect stemming from Aristotle's debate with the Platonists. Other people argue that there is some other logical dimension that is more important. So, I won't get into that. And the posterior analytics itself is a prime example of a paradigmatic use of geometry to organize the logical reduction of reasoning itself. And here we get to an interesting point, because the question, I think, for a sort of philosophical relationship with mathematics has always been that the role of the philosopher often is to reduce mathematics to logic, right? And so you could sort of wrest mathematics, or wrest the sort of primacy of mathematics away from the mathematicians a little bit, right? And sort of focus on the sort of logical methodology, which the philosopher is there, right? Sort of massaging out of the mathematics itself. And and this is in some ways also kind of emblematic of the relationship between Plato and Aristotle, or as at least the sort of later inheritors of the academy and the Aristotelians, right? So an opposition between those who sort of put primacy on the forms themselves, right, and that they have some kind of they have some kind of efficacy in knowledge, versus the Aristotelians who import a much heavier sort of logical control over what it is that we're meant to be thinking when we think, right? What is it that we're meant to be doing when we reason? And so there's a kind of, if you want, a kind of colonization of reason, right, by logic, right? A colonization of reason by logic. And that is, in fact, what is at stake in this talk. So we skipped, about 1,000 years or so, and we arrive in the 17th century in the early modern period. So what's the important precursor to some of this discussion is Platonism of Kepler and Galileo, identifying the core of knowledge with mathematical knowledge. So this is a kind of, this is something that Plato would never have accepted, right? But the form of Platonism in late Renaissance Italy and Europe suggests, was one that really highly pushed the sort of identification of geometrical knowledge with the knowledge of nature. And it's only through sort of this idea, that we find in Galileo, that the book of nature is written in mathematics, right? So to know mathematics is to know the sort of ingredients and the form. I mean, that is a Platonistic doctrine, but the emphasis on the identification of mathematics with knowledge of nature was exaggerated, I would say, in this sort of the Platonism of the early modern period. Cartesian identification of the method of knowledge with mathematical knowledge, right? This is a well-known theme. I won't get into it even that much, but so this idea that we find in In Search of Method, that we find in the discourse, not the discourse, the meditation on first philosophy, all your most basic intro to philosophy stuff is what, right? That Descartes was trying to find a method, right? A new method to find out what we can know, what we can believe in. So this is neither Platonistic nor Aristotelian, right? Because it comes with its own set of sort of consciousness structure, the structure of consciousness sort of as an important participant in this idea that that certain knowledge can only come from this method, whereas the Aristotelians don't really have that. The Platonists are just all about letting the forms themselves emerge from the kind of aporia of the dialectic, right? And crucially, this emphasis on mathematics passes over from the Cartesian generation to the next generation of Spinoza and Leibniz, right? And in Spinoza, we have logical reduction, but there's a lack of this foundational search for method, right? So Spinoza's writing of the ethics in geometrical method remains somewhat of a mystery, right? Like, what is the ultimate reason for that? I mean, the closest thing we can, the most accurate thing we can say is that what it does is it mirrors, right, in geometry, the attribute of mind and the attribute of body, right, are directly mirrored in geometrical demonstration. Why? Because, well, if you've read Euclid, right, all the demonstrations follow from drawing, like literally manipulating extension, right? And the pen or the stylus, right, is seen as the sort of immanent develop the immanent expression of the idea that the proof is trying to prove, right? So there's an immediate parallel there. But that is only to approach the door of this question, right? To see how it develops. But so anyhow, there's a lack of a foundational search for method. It's much more of an ontological statement, in fact, by Spinoza. But we'll see where we get with this later on. So the ontology knowledge link for Aristotle plays a different role in both Descartes and Spinoza, right? So Aristotle has essentially this link of abstraction, whereas Descartes and Spinoza don't really, they start to lose this notion of abstraction, right? Descartes still has something like it, right? Which is something like a correspondence in rules for the title just immediately escapes me. I was not anyways, his rules for thought, right? There is a correspondence idea, right? There's the idea that the triangle corresponds to something which will always correspond to the triangle, right? But already you have a kind of a quasi noumena kind of idea that what is really there might be very, very different, but our perception of it will always correspond to this thing. So there's a kind of more of a isomorphic idea, right? Rather than a kind of resemblance or a kind of abstraction idea, which is much more what we get from Aristotle. And the same goes for Spinoza. So as I said, one of the motivations for this, and just a little background, because Brunschvig is not super well known in non-Anglophone, non-Francophone world. He was a central figure in early 20th century, right? So died 1944 due to Nazi repression, and founded one of the sort of more important journals still in publication in France today, Revue de Metaphysique de Morale from 1893. His most famous students are probably Jean Beaufret and Simone de Beauvoir. Beaufret being the main promoter of Heidegger in France, and the famous kind of introductory text of Heidegger's letter on humanism, I want to say, is in fact a letter addressed to Beaufret. Anyway, Beauvoir does not really need any introduction. Probably more famous, the most famous one of all of these people. They were supervised by him, right? And the key idea here, and why this story is important to Brunschvig, right? I'm presenting Brunschvig as a problem. I'm not presenting Brunschvig necessarily as a solution, right? I'm not a Brunschvigian, but his idea is that the history of thought illuminates humanity's progressive but critical self-understanding. And these elements are sought in the sciences, but this progress is understanding is also a progress in universal human values, right? So he's a positivist, right? So the positive fruits of scientific development also makes us a better kind of species, right? It's kind of a naive notion that probably cannot be sustained after the 20th century, but a lot of his work is written in this spirit. So this is kind of a shorthand for what we're supposed to find out from Les Étapes. So in Les Étapes de la philosophie mathématique, Brunschvig sets out to demonstrate this thesis by pursuing not only a history of mathematics, starting quite ambitiously with ancient Babylonia, but crucially a mathematical philosophy. So it's crucial here, there's a kind of a French tradition of philosophie mathématique instead of philosophie des mathématiques. So it's this idea of philosophy thinking with mathematics rather than thinking about or colonizing, right? Like controlling the legitimacy of mathematical thinking, which is generally what we encounter in, let's say, 98.7% of what philosophy of mathematics is today. Now, I don't necessarily think philosophy of mathematics is a bad thing. I might make it right now make it sound like a bad thing, right? I think philosophy of mathematics and people who do philosophical philosophical logic like do really great work. And it's just there's this distinction here that I'm trying to capture. Still no questions. Have I been crystal clear? Okay. Okay. So, but without summarizing the book, oh wait, but let me just pause 1 second. So mathematical philosophy, philosophie mathématique, was something that I was kind of turned on to because of my teacher, my mentor, Alain Badiou. And he very much kind of argues for this. So he's always very critical of this kind of philosophy of, right? Philosophy of whatever, physics, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of, you know, social networks or whatever. Right? For Badiou, the idea is that we have these historical emergences around us, right? Whether it's the development of a certain mathematical idea, and we take that and we think with it, and we think with it philosophically, right? It doesn't have to be first controlled for its proper credentials before it can be welcomed, you know, to have a seat on the table, right? So so that's the crucial difference. In that sense, I think Badiou very much sees himself as a inheritor of some of what Brunswick thinks. He once, I think, in the early 2000s, called himself an intellectualist, which is what Brunswick called himself. But I've never seen any other time where Badiou has said this, so it could be just a blip. Anyway, a little aside about Badiou. But without summarizing the whole book, the crucial idea is that the 17th, 18th century, the maturation of the mathematical uses of the infinite and the infinitesimal, the limit of mathematical thought was logic. The conflict between logical reduction and mathematical speculation therefore governs the history of mathematics. And this is the sort of essential conflict that Brunswick is trying to bring out, kind of retrospectively from the 17th century, and then moving forward after the 17th century. So 17th century for Brunswick is like the cut in history, in the history of thought, right? Because of the emergence of the treatability of the infinite. Now, what this means is that he'll go back, for example, and he'll read Aristotle, and he'll say the limitation of Aristotelian philosophy of mathematics is this inability for them to run with it, but instead having to reduce it all the time to logic. The 17th century offers a new opportunity for thought, because with the methods of the infinite, infinitesimal, we can finally sever this connection to logic, and especially the connection to why the logic was so important, which is it's to secure its relationship to the object, right? And that's why the sort of freeing up of the infinite is also a freeing up of the object, of mathematics from its dependence to the object. I basically just said all that stuff. Right, so the second point is, I reiterate, in the two contemporaries, Spinoza and Leibniz, Brunswick identifies the difference, right? This is aided by the theme identified by Spinoza and Leibniz themselves, more geometrical. So his key point: Spinoza's more geometrical remain locked within a logical reduction because of the material and ideal resources of an infinity that continues to be limited as an abstractive potential infinite, even if this source is God itself, right? So, what is this in concrete? Like I'll point to a few passages. I won't read them in full. We can go back and look at them later if people are particularly interested. So in Les Étapes, he says, but the infinite greatness of space has as a counterpart the infinite smallness of its elements. And Spinoza glimpsed this consequence, following the scholium of Lemma 7 of the second part of the Ethics. Any given individual and the entire nature of its individuality comports an infinite degree of composition. Where are then the elementary parts that constitutes an individual, right? So this is the limitation of the Spinoza's thought, right? Further on, Spinoza reveals, quote, If I had intention, if my intention had been to write a full treatise on body, I should have had to expand my explications and demonstrations. And right, so Brunswick continues, this is the black part still. The illusions contained in his correspondence with Turnhouse permits us to presume that his doctrine of matter and of movements has not been completely achieved, right? Maybe he thought, just as Leibniz had done in the same epoch, in the conceptions inspired by the conatus of Hobbes, a means to understand the resolution of the natural system into an infinity of parts. But it was precisely this technical instrument that he lacked, and which Hobbes lacked, and that Leibniz would conquer in what he followed and employed for the renewal of universal philosophy. So for Brunswick, the key point is this, that that the common sort of problem of Spinoza, Hobbes, and Leibniz is solved by Leibniz because of this technical innovation, right? So he continues, right? I'll just read the blue part. When Spinoza insists, particularly in the letter to Louis Mayer, on the existence of incommensurable magnitudes, his goal was not to diminish numbers as being, like measurement or time, nothing but an auxiliary of imagination, and therefore push aside the classical objections against the actual infinite. The relation of incommensurability and infinity does not lead to any direct and positive study. Okay, so again, this is about the limitation of Spinoza. Here, I turn to Spinoza himself, and this is the letter that Brunswick was talking about, which is, well, I think the one he's talking about, which is the 12th letter. So he says, at first, right, he says, it is evident from what has been said that neither number, nor measure, nor time, being mere aids of the imagination, can be infinite. For otherwise, number would not be number, nor measure, nor time. It is hence abundantly evident why many who confuse these three abstractions with reality, though being ignorant of the true nature of things, have actually denied the infinite, right? So it's a bit of a convoluted reasoning here. Let me just say that. So at first, right, it seems like Spinoza is saying that these things like number, like measure, like being, are just aids to the imagination, right? But then he says it's actually the confusion of these abstraction, right, that lead people to deny the infinite. So it seems weird here, right? So how do you accept the infinite? Well, the Spinoza's answer is we need to accept the infinite in its right context, right? Yeah, I mean, I think there are, I think he's writing, oh, so the question from Katerina is he being an Aristotelian in this passage? I mean, that's quite blasphemy for any Spinozist around. I would never.
Yeah, but the treatment of the infinite.
Yeah, I would
very
not.
Similar, right?
Yeah, I would not.
And the argumentation as well.
He's being Aristotelian, but here's being fair to him. I think he faces the same limitations that Aristotelians face. How's that for being diplomatic?
Yeah, I said only this passage, so.
No, I know. It's a common thing.
The argument on the finite.
Yeah, exactly, right. So
yeah.
so essentially it's this wait, and let me just read the next passage and then we can go back to talk about that. So he says on the red parts, the key part, the wretchedness of their reasoning may be judged by mathematicians who have never allowed themselves to be delayed a moment by arguments of this sort, in the case of things which they clearly and distinctly perceive. Very Cartesian statement there. For not only have they come across many things which cannot be expressed by number, thus showing the inadequacy of number for determination of things, but also they have found many things which cannot be equaled by any number, but surpass every possible number, right? So that is Spinoza knocking on the door of the infinite. Now, whether or not the door becomes open, that's a different issue, right? So, so that's essentially Brunswick's point, right? So the infinite, right, which is God, right, is beyond number, right? And so it's a kind of, so we're approaching at this point the limit between what mathematics can think, right, and what the infinite properly is, right? So I think this will become more clear in a second. But if anybody wants to ask just a question on this, please do. We can come back to it too. So the demonstration that he gives following this in letter 12 is I'll talk about it without referring to the passage for a moment. So there are two circles, and he's trying to identify all the spaces that exist between the two circles. Obviously, it is going to be, there's not going to be no way of rationally of putting all of these spaces or all of these lines into a ratio, right? So it's going to be incommensurate, and on top of that, right, it's going to point its way to the infinite, right? So within the finite space of two concentric bodies, like off-center but concentric, you have an infinite, right? And that infinite is expressed as an incommensurable or indefinite, let's say. So, right, what he says, I'm just reading the bit I highlighted in blue, right? No number can express inequalities of distance which exist between the two circles, nor all the variations which matter in motion in the intervening space may undergo. I haven't talked about motion, but that would add another hour to this talk. But so then he says later, it springs simply from the fact the nature of the spaces between two non-concentric circles cannot be expressed in number, right? So this is meant to be his demonstration that there's some things that are beyond number, and that's precisely pointing in the direction of the infinite. Okay, so you start to get something where the infinite is sort of like hyper mathematical somehow. And then we have something from Leibniz. Now, I want to say that there's a lot of demonstration that can be given for this, but I'll just summarize very quickly and talk about Leibniz's invention of a new kind of infinite. Or not invention, he didn't invent it, but he made it very rigorous. So traditionally, you have the categorematic infinite, that is infinite in a positive and independent sense, right, in mathematics, where there is some y for which it is greater than all x's, right? So for all the x's are all the numbers, and there is some y which is greater than all of them, and that is the infinite. That's the infinite number, right? It is not finite, right? Let's put it like that. So it asserts the positive existence of that entity, right? That's the traditional infinite. And then there's the syncategorematic infinite, which is a term that is borrowed from medieval logic. We won't kind of get into it totally. We can just define it now. Infinite in a positive sense as well, but only in relation to another term or other terms, right? So infinite with respect to. It's a relational concept. So for all x, right, there is some y that right. For all x, there is some y that can be given whenever any number is given. Like God beyond the, right? So wait, okay. So the next term, right? So that's syncategorematic term is the sort of Leibnizian infinite, right? There is, so what it means is there is at least one number greater than any given number, right? So you can see how that's a relational concept, right? So it means that whatever you give me, I'll give you one bigger, right? That's all. That's what it means, all right? So. It's a promise, exactly. It's a promise. Julian said that. It's a promise. The hypercategorematic is infinite beyond enumeration and determination. And that's probably what we would usually associate with God. It certainly is what the medievals, when they came up with this tripartite distinction, would offer to God. Some people, a little bit more sort of philosophers with a little bit more materialist tendencies may ascribe that to the world as well, right? But those are exceptions, right? So Katerina, is that clear in terms of where God is.
Yeah, so the first is something like the prime mover in Aristotle, or
No, the last one, the hypercategorimatic, meaning it's
now
beyond
I see
enumeration.
that. Now I see that. And the first one is not quite clear to me. In
The
what
first one
way
is a
it
contradiction.
in independent from any mathematical operation and beyond it?
Yeah,
If
a
I-
categorimatic statement is, 5 is greater than 4.
Okay.
It belongs to like a simple assertion, right? 5 is greater than 4. Y is greater than all numbers.
No, it's clear. I misread what
No,
is
don't
F,
worry.
big
Yeah.
big F. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
no problem. I hope that's clear. I think Julian's "It's a Promise" is nicely captures it. Boom. Okay, so we have one of the most famous passages from Leibniz, just to kind of like get a sense of what he means by this in categorimatic, right? Because I just told you it's a promise, right? So what he says, according to the divisions of the continuum, must not be considered like the division of sand into grains, right? That would be the categorimatic, right? Each individual grain, right? But like that of a sheet of paper or tunic into folds, right? This is where Deleuze's Le Pli comes from, right? This is the passage from where Le Pli comes from, a tunic into folds, right? And so although there occurs some folds smaller than others, infinite in number, a body is thereby dissolved into points or minima, right? The infinity of this tunic folded together with infinite folds within itself is never resolved into the categoromatical minima like sand, right? But rather what it says is for every unfolding that you do, there is another fold, right? So this is what that is all about, right? And later on he says, and yet in this way, there's no dissolution all the way down into points, even though any point is distinguished from any other emotion, right? So the relation between two folds can be determinate without having it be determined all the way down, right? So motion is determinate. It is just as if we suppose a tunic to be scored with folds multiplied to infinity in such a way that there is no fold so small that it is not subdivided by another fold. Right. It is important to note, Julian says, it is important to note that perhaps it is still an actual and not a potential infinite. That's my next point. Julian has, that's my next point, right? So it might look now that it looks, say, really Aristotelian in another sense, meaning the denial of the infinite, but it's actually an actual infinite. Right now we have the model, which is the fold and the tunic, right? So what he will say, right, but it must be recognized that an infinite aggregate is not one whole or endowed with magnitude and has no number, right? So it's a mathematical conception of the infinite that isn't associated with a number, okay? And let me keep reading, right? And accurately speaking, instead of infinite number, it should be said that there are more that can be expressed by any number, and in place of an infinite straight line, that it is a line produced beyond any magnitude that can be assigned, so that there is always a longer and longer straight line. It is of the essence of number of line and of any whole whatsoever to be bounded. Consequently, even if the world were infinite in magnitude, it would not be one whole. Right, so he asserts a few things here. There are a few other quotes that we could have used, but this one is the most concise in a way, right? Even though it's a bit long, right? First, that when dealing with mathematical objects, we must be aware that they can also be unbounded, right? When we're dealing with when we're dealing with the infinity of the world, we need to embrace the conclusion that the world is not a whole, right? That somehow Leibniz was keen enough to get rid of this unnecessary assumption about the world, that the world is one whole, which I think is another feature of the generic infinite, right? That the world is somehow incomplete, if you will, right? And that's infinity, it just keeps going, right? That it keeps going. That is this infinity of nested folds into it, which can never be fully resolved. There is no last term, right? And so he absolves at the same time, not only the world, but of mathematical objects, of this need to be bounded, right? To be bounded. And so now we're really playing with a different kind of world, right? One in which these sort of more conservative notions, right, of the more geometrical, we've kind of broken through to the other side, right? So now the way to think with mathematics can be unlocked from its traditional geometrical sort of logical strictures, and we can start thinking with this kind of unbounded magnitude, right? And which is this sort of generic infinite, right? It's not tied to any particular form of abstraction, right? It's in fact, well, it's a promise, right? As Julian nicely says, right? In the chat. Any questions so far about that? Okay, I realize I'm running out of time. I want to vindicate Spinoza a little bit by pointing to this, right? So probably many of you know Pierre Macheret's Hegel ou Spinoza, and I won't sort of, the book is very big and very, very interesting for many reasons. But in one particular chapter, I think chapter 2, where he tries to address Hegel's criticism of Spinoza, basically saying, that the more geometrical is a very superficial thing, that's why Spinoza remains locked. It's because of his reliance on logic. And Macheret kind of gives a very nice, but judicious at the same time, a comment, right? He says, right, so the relation between mathematics and philosophy, there cannot be nothing more than a superficial resemblance, right? It remains then to be seen what might legitimate this confusion that has brought them together, specifically in Spinoza's era. According to Hegel, it is a strictly conjunctural reason which has thus lost all value in any other historical period. Very interesting remark. So basically, after Spinoza and Leibniz time, basically, like there was no reason to really, stick to that, right? He says, but this time is past. Along with all powerful dogma, the necessity of making compromises against it has disappeared. Compromises that, without these circumstances, quickly become ambiguous, right? So the argument is basically that, they needed that crutch at the time, but it's all healed up really nicely now. So let's just move on. So Macheret, pointing to some of those same passages that we looked at, like the one from Louis Mayer, letter 12, he says the difference is essentially that between the science of the infinite and the science of the infinite. And it's clear that in these two cases, the word science designates something completely different realities. On one, abstract knowledge that is always finds its object in exteriority, right? So this is the kind of characterization of a kind of Aristotelian characterization of mathematics, right? In order for it to be a science, it needs to draw its object in from the outside, right? And therefore must remain finite, right? Because there's a limit between your method and the object. And on the other hand, right, he says, a concrete knowledge, this is Hegelian speak, but we don't have to pay too much attention to the abstract concrete pair here, that is itself its own content and is thus made absolute, right? So this is the Hegelian ideal, right, of the concept, right? That its own content is that which is its own proper object. It doesn't have to draw it from the outside, right? And so Macheret kind of vindicates Spinoza a little bit here, right? He says, if intellect, which is the locus par excellence, whereby to know and to represent are formally identical, is a necessary determination of rational thought, a moment that has its place in the process of the body of knowledge exists exactly through the limitation that situates it somewhere in this unfolding, right? So sort of uses Hegel back on itself, which is sort of the right, strategy to do, right? They say, what the famous Foucault passage statement that, you try to get away from Hegel and you find him again in the dark corner waiting for you. But the right move is what Marchais does, right? Which is use
I'm
Hegel.
sorry, Tzuchien, can you
Yeah.
stop just for a second to fix the recording? Is the recording ongoing?
I heard recording stopped at some point.
I heard as well.
I think Reese is having problems with his computer. Just 1 second.
Yeah, he's not even logged in.
Maybe some time for some. Okay, back.
Uh,
Okay.
Yeah, the recording is.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
So we can continue, right, Zach?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, in a way, I feel like I've said a lot. Maybe the next few passages are not super important, but basically, I want to make a better case of defending Spinoza against these things, these charges. Yeah, I highly recommend Marchais. But I mean, essentially, he says this. I'll just come to that little red quote there. But we must understand that this critique of abstraction does not lead us to recall a well-known formula of Cavaillés from a philosophy of concept to a philosophy of judgment. Thought that affirms itself in each idea is not the manifestation of the free subject that reigns over its products and its creation like a king in his kingdom, right? So again, this idea that Spinoza's thinking with more geometrical thinking style, Marchais vindicates him from having that kind of sort of dominating approach, but rather it's kind of a process of becoming, right? As Cavaillés would affirm, right? And so. Yeah, so I think Spinoza, I think it's possible to vindicate Spinoza from the charges that I've mentioned earlier from Brunswick and then sort of what seems to be Hegel's view. So a few concluding remarks, things to think with. Right, so I hope, my main goal here, and I hope I've at least accomplished this much, is that the moral geometrical and philosophical modernity moves away from the process of abstraction, which we inherit from the Aristotelian tradition with respect to the infinite. And in particular, and I think this point I don't think really has been made before by other people, the syncategorematical infinite renders a generic infinite unattached to a domain of objects, and therefore a kind of historical a priori, whether as a threat to the very project of metaphysics, let's say the determination of things, or categorical determination of things, or as a hope, right? A speculative element, a promise, if you will, right? In this rereading of Spinoza, the problem of infinite is dissolved into the immanent indeterminate, right? So that is the doorstep of this generic infinite. The figure of the infinite as a process of becoming, and this coordination between being and thought does not achieve what Brunswick says, to bring the infinite down from the heavens, but it does establish a science of the infinite, even if it is a historically limited as a concept, right? So again, using Hegel back on itself, Spinoza's limitation is precisely Spinoza's participation in the progressive sort of thinking with the infinite science, right? So a mathematical philosophy then can emerge from this conjunction as an alternative to the positivist, quote, philosophy of mathematics, that is, that I hear all the kids are into these days. So the counterfactual, right? So the counterfactual would be something like, can there be a mathematical philosophy in a finite world, right? So all this emphasis on the infinite may let us kind of consider whether or not what we could do with the finite, and whether they would still be mathematics if things were merely finite. And I think that's a very fun practice to engage in, to sort of like radically question the premises of your own talk. So anyway, that's enough for me. Look forward to this question and answer with everyone.
Okay, let the discussion begin. Who will ask the first question, comment?
If you don't want to be put on the spot, I'm very happy to read a chat.
No, people here are very talkative usually.
Thank you, Luca, for coming. It's been a while since we've caught up.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it has to be in this like boring history of philosophy talk, and not like in person in a cafe somewhere. But
Yeah, that's all
hey,
pre-COVID now.
yeah,
There she is.
yeah, hey.
You look great. Okay, so who will?
Yeah,
whoever wants
I
to
can ask
speak.
I can ask
Yeah,
a question.
of course, of course.
Yeah, yeah. In a way you've been tracing back the part two to Lacan back to Leibniz, right? In that important passage that you do. So is Leibniz able to do this folding because he doesn't embed the fold into the space, right? So he can claim this kind of part two because there is no space in which the fold is embedded, but the other way around, that the space kind of is generated from the fold.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. That is. I'm gonna write that down. That's a great way to put it. That's really good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I would have come to it myself at some point, but you said it first.
Well, we've been talking enough about these
Yeah.
things that you know, it
Yeah.
has come through me. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, can we do more historical damage by saying that that maybe from this concept that Leibniz invented the Dedekind cut, like the fold is a Dedekind cut, right?
Okay, so that would be my next question then,
Okay.
about the object. So
Right.
you're kind of saying that the introduction of something generic abdicates the object.
Mhm.
And in the Leibnizian sense, because there is not this absolute maximum which stands over all the different cases, kind of. There's no such object. But don't we have the object all the time? And kind of combined question, I mean, in terms of, you know, bringing God or bringing the infinite away from God down to earth, so through mathematics. I mean, the mathematics just has these infinite objects, and takes the sacredness out of it. So isn't that the big step?
I mean, there's much more there. I think, I mean, I was just joking about doing historical damage, but I don't think it was that clear for them what they were doing. I think maybe one thing I should emphasize is the emergence of all this stuff is extremely contingent and perhaps even non-conceptual, like in the Hegelian sense, that it was a technical innovation. I mean, now we're very materialist now, talking very materialistically about this, right? About the development of the manipulation of certain kinds of science, right? Is the material, and then afterwards you realize what you've done, you know? And so there's a kind of a concept that follows perhaps a not conceptually developed, like just following through on certain mechanical practices of sign manipulation, right? This is sort of the beautiful thing about algebra and the possibilities that can be afforded to you when you, I don't know, solve the binomial theorem or something like that, right? And you develop a new way of thinking about quantities. And you can establish, for example, the differential, and which is, you know, from a certain perspective, just looks like a fraction, right? But it's just written in a weird way, right? And that allows you to really develop the syncagrammatic infinite, right? It means that assuming that at a point there is an infinitesimal change, right?
Where this is the departure from logic, right? That's the departure from logic or from.
Yeah, exactly. That we take seriously the marks that we're making, the writing of the form right? Instead of the concept which the writing is supposed to represent, right? Or the reasoning that the writing is supposed to represent, or the rules which it obeys, or something like that, right? That the writing itself provides its own form of speculation, and you know, well, if you will, right, the fold generating the space, right? So it kind of goes back to that somehow, but there's a kind of non-conceptual element to this, right? A kind of contingent development, and then what to do with the objects? That's the second question, right? So I mean, a part of what I probably should put into the final version of this paper is with the development of, well, the syncagrammatic infinite is a response to people saying, but what the hell is this infinitesimal anyway? Does it exist in nature? You know, what's going on with this Leibniz? It seems inconsistent and possibly impious. You know, give us some explanation. And so this explanation from the syncagrammatic is a kind of retrospective or retroactive conceptualization of a technical innovation. And it's at that point that these objects start to lose, I think, their specificity as objects of, you know, but instead simply some stuff I cooked up on a piece of paper or something like that, you know. We can call them objects of a certain kind. Something like that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I think so.
Anyone else? You can either raise your hand here in the reactions, on the reactions button, or just start speaking. So whichever suits you.
I mean, I do realize that this talk isn't in the usual vein of what you do. It's usually, the topic is a lot hipper. I feel like this is like kind of a very traditional, old-fashioned, like philosophy talk, you know, kind of thing.
It is. We have had such talks.
It's usually sexier in this.
Oh no, there was just, you know.
But this is all I can do.
Classical mathematics professors with certain Marxist inclinations. So we had such talks as well. So yeah. So this is not that unusual. No, it was really dense, and there were so many, you know, so many complex arguments. That's why we kept quiet. We were really following closely
Sorry,
and
sorry.
enjoying.
Sorry.
I asked when I had a question, needed a clarification. So yeah, it was actually quite enjoyable. Maybe that's why there were not questions or interruptions.
It could also be that when I'm lecturing in
Mhm.
like a room and I can see people's faces,
Mhm.
maybe I talk too quickly at some points. Maybe.
No, you talk passionately. And it's engaging, and I don't know, I loved it. So
Well, thank you.
anyway, but precisely for those to whom this is, too classical or alien, the style or the content of the talk, please ask for clarifications. It doesn't have to be simple questions, explanations. It doesn't have to be a debate necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, I will ask you a question. I'm just giving the floor first to, the audience. Then
Sure.
I don't want to usurp my position. So, does anybody have? Exactly.
I can ask a very stupid question because I also.
No such thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if this question even makes any sense. It's just, if you, I don't know, you look at something like set theory, I was just wondering about a sort of category question about infinites. So that are like each different sort of Aleph, or however you pronounce it, from whatever, just the finite numbers and onwards, would we categorize them as the sort of same form of infinite, or is there a different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Not at all a stupid question. One can interpret the emergence of sort of transfinite set theory as the dissolution of the finite infinite distinction. Now, obviously, the sort of more than finite numbers you could say is infinite, right? And just in a merely negative designation to say they're not finite numbers. We have finite numbers on the left. These aren't them, so they're infinite, right? You could say that, but there is a crucial kind of role played by the finite infinite, especially for the finite numbers, which played an important role for thousands of years. So that should be preserved in some way, but in a way to say that after the transfinite revolution, maybe it makes no real sense to talk about the infinite anymore. Like, it's not a useful concept anymore for modern mathematics, but it is useful for, like, obviously Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz and Galileo, they all thought it was important to use that term. So therefore we use it. So maybe that helps with satisfying.
Yeah. Thanks. It was just.
Yeah, and the alephs are not syncategorematic, right? They are actually an assertion of an independent status. They're not relational, right?
Yeah.
So good. And then Jonathan
sorry?
had a question. Jonathan had a question. Oh, Julian, did you want to follow up? Was it a follow-up?
No, I just wanted to say one thing, that the finite also becomes kind of erased, and you said that, but just to complete it again, that the finite and the infinite kind of become both quite relative notions. Yeah,
everything gets weird, as they say. So Jonathan had a question. This is perhaps the bad question, no, but what do you see, if any, of the relationship between history of mathematics and the philosophy of mathematics? That's really that's a good question. I think about this daily. Maybe you have a view about this. Maybe it's a view that we should all discuss together. But for me, I think what is interesting is, so every year I teach Thomas Kuhn, right? Everyone's familiar with the work of Thomas Kuhn, the paradigm, the idea being that, real science occurs, right, really on the edges when paradigms are being born, and then it's normal science, and then normal science gets ossified, and the holes are filled in, and then it just dies, right? And then we need the new paradigm, and that this process it's an extreme form of, or at least in the 1962 version. Kuhn has said different things now, 40 years later, 50 years later, but at least in the 62 version, Kuhn, it's a very radical form of historicism, right? Of kind of a relativism about truth, and especially a very historicized notion of truth, scientific truth. Now, whether or not Kuhn is right, there does not seem to be an available argument in mathematics for this, right? Once the principles of geometry are discovered, they remain true, right? Now, you could say, well, what about non-Euclidean geometry? Non-Euclidean geometry is an extension of geometry. It's not a contradiction of geometry, right? It is classic theory extension. You take all the axiom, you throw one away and see what happens, right? You see what else you can prove, right? What kind of weird stuff happens when you just take a nice, complete set of axioms and you just throw one out, right? So it's very, 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 so non-Euclidean geometry, at least the standard forms of it, is an addition, not a contradiction. So it doesn't happen like the paradigm shift where you have brand new objects, you have brand new kind of truths, that are developed for that paradigm, and the old paradigm kind of dissolves. What you really have a very different kind of situation in mathematics. So mathematics seems to be much more continuous, or allows us to invoke a much more continuous interpretation than let's say physics or astronomy, and that there's something kind of Platonistic about that, in the sense that there's something kind of eternal about mathematical truths once they get produced, right? And therefore, it is no surprise that even in the 20th and 21st century, there's still many mathematicians that would call themselves Platonists, right? So it's to use an Arthurian phrase, the spontaneous philosophy of the mathematicians. So the history of mathematics doesn't play the same role as the history of science in the philosophy of mathematics, right? So the history of mathematics, in discovering a proof, one doesn't locate the truth in a historical time. So it seems like the philosophy of mathematics, or the history of mathematics, identifies like how mathematics becomes, right, rather than indexing historicized truths to specific periods. I don't know. I guess myth busting is a good thing for historians to do. Like, people have all these misconceptions about, especially the past, right? So the narrative always goes like this: everything sucked before, and now that we're so smart, and we live in the enlightened age, and the thing that preceded us was bad and dark and full of superstitions, right? That's often how it's. So the historian of mathematics can do a little myth busting by showing, no, they were okay too. Just a few things changed between now and then, and maybe try to demonstrate our own sort of like idiocy as well, right? Like, what are our current limitations? So maybe some of that. I don't know. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. There is no one who wants to say something. I can ask a question. So,
Please.
I've been going through Aristotle's work lately, for months actually. And yes, I agree. Your reading of his invention of the abstraction itself as something that is subtracted, that is abstracted from the real and turned into a conceptual object. I agree with that. I mean, that's how I read all those passages that concern this question. And it's very interesting that, you know, he does not substantiate abstraction. So he does not presume that an abstraction is a ousia, a substance, a being, an entity in and of itself. So it's something independent from the entities, from ousiae. He even says, for example, all of these abstract notions like space or times, etc., there is something to T that is attributed and fixed to a ousia. So it's already in the realm of, you know, whatever we as, you know, these cognitive machines produce, you know, it's it's there, and I think it's located there even in Aristotle himself. Now, he arrives to this conclusion thanks mainly to the, let's call it an axiom, of the presupposition that things of which we speak must be finite. If you remember this passages. So,
Yes.
and the assumption of the Eleatics that, you know, the being is infinite, therefore, you know, everything mathematical is infinite. If the two are conflated, disabled the possibility of thinking space or motion, if you remember.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
He kind of solves this problem by this philosophical decree he makes. There must be finitude, and this is the foundation of everything counted, everything thought through mathematically or philosophically. He would use that term, I guess. Why was your talk in a way a defense of the infinite, and why so? If that was the case.
Thank you.
Yeah,
You've just, you know, wonderfully identified the sort of the motivation of the talk and of thinking through this thing historically and conceptually. Yeah, it's sort of like the power of the infinite, essentially. Now, whether this is good or bad, I would say is up to you to interpret. I'm definitely on the side of the infinite, and I mean the flip side of that is, I mean, you know, this notion of connection, right? That Aristotle emphasizes. Well, the separation is the connection. You know, the separation of the triangle from the traffic cone, let's say, is the connection that geometrical objects have with the objects of this world. Now, why? Now, as you say, you know, why are these things not ousia? Well, I mean, that's the motivation, right? Because he wants to defeat the Platonists, and it seemed like without this abstractive kind of story, the Platonists would almost always win, especially with mathematicians, right? Where in fact the mathematical objects do stand independently, right? And so Aristotle wants to have this sort of mediated version of the origin And I think what you say is perfectly right. I didn't really think about that whilst working on this, but that's absolutely perfect, right? Like the necessary finitude of the objects of knowledge, right, is crucial in, I mean, it's just like page after page of that in the physics, right? Yeah, anything that's wrong is wrong because it involves infinite.
Yeah, it's mainly in physics.
Yeah.
Elsewhere as well. I think now I can't remember. It's been months since I haven't that paper, but yeah, it's mainly in physics.
Yeah. And in the posterior
And
analytics.
in the corruzione, I think.
Yeah. Beginning. Yeah. True. So anyhow, no, I totally accept this point. I will put this in the final paper. I think that's a crucial point that I failed to mention. Okay. It's about time for me to go. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we get it. Okay.
Yeah, we got children. It's not. Yeah. It's all right. So thank you very much for this. I hope we can work together in the future again. And thanks.
Of course.
Thank all of you for showing up. Yeah.
About the book project mentioned at the beginning, but that's a different story, inside story. Yeah, thanks for everybody who joined in. Thanks for everybody who watched online, who watched the stream. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Tzuchien, and see you again soon. Okay, thanks. Bye.